Stefan. Thank you all.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is having a fantastic day, and we are so glad that you could join us today for this year's panel on criminal law and the death penalty. This is my third time moderating this panel, and it's always such a pleasure and a joy because we have such an amazing panel of professionals here who are in this substantive area of law that are going to give some really good feedback and advice about navigating your interest in this if you have any interest in pursuing criminal law or any sort of related subject area as a career. So today we will hopefully introduce you all to pro bono and public interest career options and pro bono opportunities in criminal law. And so I will just quickly name off our panelists and then ask each of them to sort of give us a little bit of background, a little brief introduction about who they are, where they work, and what type of work that they do in this current role. First, we have Emily Olson Galt, who is the Director and Chief Counsel for the Death Penalty Representation Project at the American Bar Association. Then we have Naida Henao, who is the Head of Engagement at the Network for Victim Recovery of DC. We also have Andrew Wise, who is the chair of Miller and Chevalier's litigation department. We have Matthew Hellman, who is the co-chair of the appellate and Supreme Court practice at Jenner and Block. And then we have Tara Chin, who is a staff attorney at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. So starting with Tara, why don't we go around and have each of our panelists introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about them.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me and for everybody who's tuning in here. I hope it's going to be helpful for everyone. I am lucky in that I work at the Public Defender Service for DC, and I don't work in a traditional trial attorney capacity. I actually am fortunate in that I get to work along the whole spectrum of a criminal case and how it impacts a client. So I do work with trial attorneys on sentence mitigation, on some conditions of confinement while they are pre-trial. I also do disciplinary hearings at the jail, but I also work on the other end in terms of after people have been incarcerated for many decades and are seeking release either through the parole process or through a resentencing motion in DC Superior Court. I also work on the real true end of the process, which is after, of course, somebody is in the community, on supervision, seeking early termination of supervision, and also seeking some kind of ceiling relief as a result of having a criminal record. And we also do a little bit of some of the employment consequences of that as well, and representation for people on that behalf. So it's a mixed bag, but it all is really rooted in how someone's life is impacted by having a criminal record, even if it's just an arrest, not even necessarily a conviction, and doing everything we can to alleviate that barrier so that people can be successful and access economic opportunity in the community. So thank you again for having me here.
Thank you so much, Tara. Why don't we move to Matthew Hellman?
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today and talk with all of you. So I can't claim to be in the trenches in the same way that some of our fellow panelists here have been on criminal law and death penalty issues. But at my firm, Jenner and Block, I've had the good fortune to work on many pro bono matters, and I've often found myself drawn to those involving the death penalty or other criminal matters. And I'm an appellate lawyer by trade, so I'm often coming in after there's been a record in the trial court and a case is going up on appeal. And that's really played out, and I think we'll talk a little more about this as the day goes on. That's played out in a couple of ways for me. I've been pretty involved in lethal injection litigation throughout my career, especially as a younger lawyer. Actually, my first trial was a bench trial on the constitutionality of Missouri's lethal injection protocol, and we won. We got it struck down. And then this spring, I actually just argued a death penalty lethal injection case in the Supreme Court. We're waiting to hear what's going to happen with that. So that's been one focus of mine. And then another is the courts of appeals often appoint counsel, younger lawyers, to argue criminal cases on appeal. We do a lot of those in the Seventh Circuit, where my firm has a Chicago office. And it's one of my favorite things to do to supervise those appeals for younger attorneys. And that's a great opportunity for those who might be interested in getting an appellate opportunity and getting to stand up and actually try to argue a case on appeal. So that's part of how I've worked in pro bono and criminal law and death penalty issues into my practice, and looking forward to talking more with you about that.
Thanks so much, Matt. Before we move on, I do want to encourage attendees, if you all start having any questions already, feel free to put them in the chat so that we can make sure that we structure our discussion today around whatever those questions are going to be. So if you hear someone's introduction and you're more interested in learning about what they do or how they got to that position, please feel free to write it in the chat, and we'll try to address questions as we move along. But for our introductions, why don't we move to Andy Wise?
Hi, Stefan. It's great to see everybody, and thank you to the council for sponsoring this. I've had the good fortune of working with the council on some trial skills training sessions for lawyers that are doing pro bono work in the past, and it's a wonderful group of folks and an organization that's doing really important work. So I am the chair of the litigation department at Miller & Chevalier. We are a DC law firm that practices in litigation, international, and tax. And my practice is primarily in the white collar space, which means representing individuals that are dealing with the federal government, usually the DOJ and the SEC, and doing internal investigations for companies that are facing enforcement actions. My guess is, though, that the reason that I'm here is because I started my career for 5 years as a lawyer at the Public Defender Service, which I will tell you all later was the single greatest job I've ever had. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about that as a path toward eventually ending up in different places in the law. My firm does a fair amount of pro bono work too. Like Matt's, a lot of our stuff is focused on work with the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project on behalf of individuals that are appealing convictions. Part of my pro bono practice also has been representing PDS lawyers who get into issues with judges that don't properly understand the role of a zealous advocate in the adversarial system as our system works. So that's kind of been an interesting opportunity that the firm has provided in terms of kind of doing continuing pro bono work on behalf of folks that are actually doing the real work in the trenches. So.
Thanks so much, Andy. And yes, we will definitely lean on you to sort of explain or give us some feedback on like how to make certain transitions in career. So we really appreciate you bringing that perspective. Next, why don't we move to Naida?
Hello, everyone. I'm so honored to be here with my fellow panelists. My name is Naida Hanau, and I work for the Network for Victim Recovery of DC. So NVRDC is a DC-based nonprofit that provides free, holistic, and trauma-informed services, legal and advocacy services to victims of any type of crime. And I think that's what kind of makes us unique. A lot of nonprofits specialize in certain types of victimization, such as sexual assault or domestic violence, but we really serve the full spectrum of victimizations, including victims of power-based violence, but also the surviving family members of homicide victims, hate crime victims, victims of elder abuse, and youth survivors as well. And so while I'm currently the head of engagement at VRDC, I started my career off as a staff attorney or a crime victims' rights attorney, and then also did some legislative advocacy with our organization. And just to situate those folks who are kind of like, excuse me, crime victims attorney, I have never heard the term before. So just to be a little clear, while we have a public defenders in a criminal case and we have the prosecutors, most people tend to assume that the prosecutor represents the victim in the case, while some of us may already know that the prosecutor is actually representing the interests of the public. So I am an attorney for the crime victim. I have attorney-client privilege. They're my boss, and so I help them assert their crime victims' rights under both federal and local law. And I've assisted clients in their criminal cases where there's charges that are being prosecuted, but also in civil protection orders at DC Superior Court and Title IX actions in all the 8 DC universities and colleges.
Thanks so much, Naida. And last but certainly not least, we have Emily Olsen-Galt.
Thanks so much for having me here today. It's great to be here with this panel. So I am the Director and Chief Counsel of the Death Penalty Representation Project, which is an entity that is part of the American Bar Association's nonprofit arm. We're actually part of a group called the Center for Public Interest Law at the ABA, which works on a variety of public interest issues. And the Death Penalty Representation Project has actually been around for over 35 years now, and was created in response to a situation that developed in the early 1980s, where we had all these prisoners on death row and no constitutional right to counsel for any of them. And unfortunately, 35 plus years later, that is still the case. There is still no constitutional right to counsel for people on death row. And so what we do is work with people like Matt and Andy and members of the private bar to provide counsel to those people who are facing the death penalty. And our work has expanded a lot over the years. We still recruit lawyers to take on pro bono death penalty cases as the core of our work, but we also engage in a lot of advocacy and reform, because even if there's not a federal constitutional right to counsel, we can encourage states to provide adequate access to counsel. And so we promulgate standards and write amicus briefs and try to encourage, even where it's not required, the states to provide adequate indigent defense services and post-conviction services. And we've had good success with that, but there's still a huge need for pro bono counsel in these cases. Some of them are collateral litigation, like Matt was discussing, the lethal injection, and some of it's states where people in their ordinary post-conviction appeals, where they're trying to prove that they had ineffective trial counsel, or that there was racial bias or prosecutorial misconduct, or even innocence. They're just in that initial stage trying to raise these really serious claims, and they don't have a lawyer to help them. And so we work with members of the private bar to provide that counsel and that assistance. We've worked with about 200 law firms from across the country on these cases. We've placed more than 400 cases with pro bono volunteers. These numbers are since 1998. We unfortunately don't have numbers from before then. And our pro bono volunteers have successfully gotten death sentences commuted to life or a term of years, or even had proved people that were innocent and won their release in well more than 100 cases. So they really do phenomenal work and make a huge difference in people's lives. And it's an honor to be able to facilitate that work, to support that work, provide training and resources, and help get people the help that they need in these life and death cases.
Thanks so much, Emily, and all of our panelists for just explaining sort of what you do. And as I mentioned before, I mean, everyone's work sounds so interesting. So I'm excited to get to know a little bit more about what brought you all here. And speaking of, I think that one of the first questions that I wanted to ask any of you who would like to answer is, when did you first realize that you were interested in criminal law? And, you know, can you sort of go through some of those steps that you took in the initial stage to sort of like manifest that interest into a career around criminal law? I'll start with Emily because she's on the screen.
So I had known I wanted to be a lawyer for a long time, but it was really in law school that I became focused on criminal law, and specifically the death penalty. I took a full-year capital defense clinic from the amazing Tony Amsterdam when I was in law school, worked directly on capital cases. I worked on Roper v. Simmons, the case that abolished the juvenile death penalty, while I was in law school. And kind of after that, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. So I kind of had the inverse career of Andy. I went to a big law firm first, and was recruited by the ABA as a young lawyer to take on a pro bono death penalty case. We put together this great team of young associates and a couple partners who were willing to work with us, and took on this really heartbreaking but very worthwhile case out of Texas involving an innocent client who had been on death row since 1980. And so my entire time that I was there, I worked on this death penalty case, did some other pro bono work as well, and a whole lot of billing work too, of course. I don't want to imply that all I was doing was my death penalty case, and got some great litigation skills. And then after a few years, saw this opportunity to go to the ABA and do this full time and help work on these cases on a national level all over the country. And so kind of jumped at the opportunity, first became a staff attorney, and then eventually became the director.
I'm going to start calling out people. Oh, I see.
I'm happy to jump in.
Great.
So I didn't know that I wanted to do anything related to criminal law until law school. Before law school, I was pretty set on doing international human rights abroad, actually. And I, in the course of going to law school, became aware of the incredible human rights crisis happening in our own country, in our jails and prisons. And so it very quickly became apparent to me, like, why on earth would I go to other countries to work on issues when we have such a dire need here in our country? But it wasn't like a fully formed thing. It was something that I gained more education on. And actually, before I came to the Public Defender Service, I did a whole bunch of different types of clerkships and internships. But I started out as a DOJ honors attorney for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which is not a normal route to PDS at all. But I did employment litigation for them, which was a lot of staff discipline cases. And so it gave me a very unique understanding of why correctional systems work the way they do, the sort of accountability measures that are or are not in place, and the challenges systemically that all of my clients are facing in that system. And it has dramatically informed and made me very good at my job today at PDS in trying to help navigate that system, strategically improve that system, and at a really core level, improving people's conditions of confinement and trying to divert as many people from the system as possible. I have so many clients that do not need to be in prison, should not be in prison, and knowing and educating definitely judges and also even attorneys representing people on what it really means to serve a sentence in jail and in prison, what that means for somebody with an intellectual disability, what that means for somebody who has certain labels that have been attached to them because of their offensive conviction or because of groups that they've been said that they are affiliated with, whether or not that actually may be true, painting those pictures and what services are available or probably more likely are not available when we talk about sending somebody to prison for rehabilitation purposes, what we really can expect out of that process. And if that person is coming back into our community, what does that mean for us as a community as well? So it was an unusual path to where I am, but it was intentional. It wasn't something that I could totally see on the front end, but on the back end, like everything that I have done helps me do my job today and to do it really well. And so I guess what I would say to everybody is there's more than one way to where you want to be. And if you believe in something and you want to do it, then go for it.
Thanks, Tara. And speaking of more than one way, I want to turn to your other former sort of PDS colleague, Mr. Wise. You mentioned earlier that PDS was one of the best jobs that you ever had. So can you tell us sort of like what interested you about that organization or the work and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, so I came to it when I was in college, really. I was a political science major in college, thought I was going to do government policy work, and then spent a summer at PDS as an investigator after getting a letter from a lawyer there who was trying homicide cases and said, if you really want to see what the legal system's all about, you should come kind of work with me for a summer. And so I did, and she had some amazing trials the summer that I was there. And as an investigator, you essentially, kind of roll around the city trying to figure out what it is that your clients are charged with. Because in the criminal context, in a criminal case, when someone's charged with a serious crime, you get very little information about what the charge is. And it's really on the lawyer to go figure it out. It's really pretty remarkable when you get into civil litigation and you realize in civil cases how much discovery gets exchanged between the parties, because it would be terrible if someone got surprised at trial. And in a criminal case, when you have somebody who's fighting for, literally their liberty, perhaps for the rest of their life, a lot of times you find out who the witnesses are while the prosecutors tell the jury as the trial begins to make sure that nobody gets surprised. It's a really kind of inverted system in that way. So I spent a summer doing that, which was really interesting. And it's what led me to know that I wanted to be a public defender. But it's funny, I started at PDS, and I think I was not atypical. I was one of these people that thought it was a really interesting job because it was going to give me the opportunity to defend the Fourth Amendment and defend the Sixth Amendment and these kind of constitutional rights that seemed very important and are. I'm not trying to belittle that at all, but my experience as a PDS lawyer was that what made the job so amazing and what made the experience so powerful was realizing how often you were the only person in the courtroom that was going to stand up behind your client. That, you know, cases would get called and you could feel the disdain from the prosecutors and the marshals, and sometimes even the court clerks, often the judges. And it was a very kind of humbling thing to realize that it was kind of you and your client against basically everybody else in a lot of these cases. And so very quickly for me, it became less about kind of the defending the Constitution and much more about defending the individual. People often ask public defenders, like, how can you do this work? How can you represent folks that are charged with these terrible crimes? And that was really the answer, that it for very quickly, it became kind of, it was you standing with your client and trying to convince a court and maybe a jury and sometimes a prosecutor that your client, you know, shouldn't be defined by the worst thing that they've ever been accused of doing. And so that became something that was very defining for me. I left PDS after 5 years. Frankly, I left too early. I left because I had trouble balancing the pressure of the job with other parts of life. And I, you know, for about a year after I left, I'd be up at the dog park and people would say, what do you do? And I would say, I'm a public defender. You know, I wasn't, and nobody at the dog park really cared. But like, it became such a part of my identity that I spent a lot of time kind of saying that's what I was, even after I left. So I think it's kind of a testament to how powerful some of these jobs can be in terms of how you define yourself and you know, your role as a lawyer. So.
Thanks so much for that perspective. And I definitely want to also turn around to Matt to talk about not just criminal law, but also the appellate work that you do. You mentioned earlier that you're not sort of in the trenches, but I still would consider that in the trenches because a lot of people, you know, lose their appellate rights in a lot of respects. So I think it would be interesting to hear if you always had an interest in criminal law, but also the appellate side of it instead of the trial side.
Yeah, I thought, in part because I didn't really know any better when I was leaving law school, that what I would want to do is appellate law. I wasn't even 100% sure what that meant, but it seemed like the kind of thing I would want to do. And what I sort of quickly learned it's a little bit like what Andy is talking about when you're in a trial, when you're doing appellate law, and particularly when you're doing appellate law on behalf of a disadvantaged client, you have just this enormous power, and with that comes the obligation to take, you know, this body of law, cases that have, you know, come up over 2 centuries maybe, and try to distill it down to the very best argument you can give to a 3-judge panel, a 9-justice panel, whoever it might be. And it's sort of like it's sort of up to you and the team to figure out, of all the arguments that you might be able to make, you know, what, and in the 30 pages of briefing and the half hour of argument that you have, you know, what can you do on behalf of this client that will give him or her the best chance of succeeding. And you know, when you're a trial attorney, there are 20,000 decision points. When you're an appellate attorney, I guess there are a lot of decision points about like what you end up finally deciding to argue, but really the moments of influence are fewer and further between. At least that's been my experience. And so it really feels like it counts. And it's enormously gratifying to really, whether you win or lose, you hope that you can win, but winning on appeal is tough sometimes, to feel like you've brought a team of people together, you've brought resources to bear on behalf of a client that maybe makes a case that looked tough. Actually, you can just say, no, this is why it's right for our guy that you know, to reverse, or and if it's not a criminal case, to affirm. And you know, it sort of never gets old. And some of my most satisfying work has been, particularly in the pro bono space, being able to sort of report back to a client, you know, what we were able to accomplish on his or her behalf in that sphere. It's my favorite part of the job. It really is.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad that we got a chance to hear that perspective. And I definitely also want to hear from Naida, because you mentioned, I think in your intro, that a lot of people may not think about sort of the representational aspect for victims, for crime victims. So I would love to hear sort of if that was always in your thought, like if you were always interested in that particular aspect of this, and how you transitioned into a career centered around that.
Yeah, thanks. I feel like there's little bits and pieces of everyone's career path that I was also on at some point. Like Tara, I actually started with law school wanting to do international human rights work. And that's how I ended up doing the moot court team for the International Criminal Court competition. And they had a victim's attorney under the International Criminal Court model. And I thought like, oh, wouldn't that be nice? But kind of like, you know, unicorn-like dream for our own justice system, but really didn't think anything of it except for it being really cool and interesting in that moment. But then afterwards got more involved into criminal law and law school and thought I would actually do criminal appellate work eventually, but wanted to start by doing trial work first and getting kind of that skill set ready to go before moving on to appellate work. So I did my clerkship, intern at the U.S. Attorney's Office Appellate Section, but then I ran into a job posting for NVRDC and realized that the unicorn role within the criminal legal system could actually be true in our country. And so I applied and started as a staff attorney. And as I said before, for crime victims' rights here in DC, we're often litigating on behalf of our clients to assert the rights under the DC Crime Victim Bill of Rights or federally under the Crime Victims' Rights Act. And that has been really interesting to me because no one in law school ever mentioned that under criminal law, there was something other than being a defense attorney or being a prosecutor. And what I've loved about being a crime victims' rights attorney is that you get to see the individual, and it's not about this sometimes a false binary about like there's the what the victim wants and what the defendant wants. And I think what being a crime victims' rights attorney has allowed me to do on behalf of my clients is to advocate that different clients have different visions of what justice means to them, and it's not always what's being represented by the prosecutor. And so it's great to be able to have someone who is there to help empower the client and to give them their voice within the criminal legal system, and not having to be represented by someone who may or may not have checked in with how they feel about the plea bargain, or may not have given them an opportunity to speak about restitution and what their needs are, or doesn't give them as much of a voice during the victim impact statement. And I think what has just been wonderful is to see how different the criminal legal system process can look like when the victim is involved and they're empowered to talk about their needs and their background, because again, many times we wouldn't end up in the same place when it comes to sentencing. A lot of my clients love, for example, restorative justice. And so I think it's just helped me see the entire area of law differently, to argue for things more creatively. For example, I'm sure many people perhaps wouldn't have anticipated that as a crime victims' rights attorney, I spend a lot of time with motions for subpoenas for my clients' personal records. And a lot of times judges are kind of surprised to see us jump in on motions like that. And so it's a really interesting area of law for you to think outside of the box, perhaps, not the just kind of like criminal law 101. And it really requires you to have that creativity when it comes to advocacy, because you're often dealing with case law that doesn't involve the crime victims' rights attorney or doesn't provide for, that standing, or you can't look to other jurisdictions to see how they ruled on your motion before. So it's really exciting to be difficult. We've been threatened with contempt for the judges who don't know what a crime victims' rights attorney is and think I'm just some random person, kind of standing up in the middle of the trial. So yeah, that's pretty much it. But I just think it's a great area of law for people who are perhaps not feeling pulled towards one side or the other, and perhaps want to explore like what is this about, and how do I feel about a role that's perhaps not as clearly defined as the others have been.
Thanks so much, Naida, and everyone for explaining sort of your interest and how you got to the point where you are today. I definitely want to ask as many of you as possible, what are some important relationships that you've maintained throughout your career, whether it be a professor, whether it's a judge, whether it's any colleagues, and how did those professional relationships help you personally, professionally, or what have you? And I guess I'll start with Emily.
Sure. I mean, I think I mentioned the clinic I took in law school, and I think that was probably the single most important relationship was my relationship with my professor. I was fortunate enough to work with him both in the actual seminar portion of the clinic, but also in my field work, and so got to know him very well. And he's such a brilliant and phenomenally respected lawyer in this area, that when I wanted to make the move out of private practice and into back into full-time public interest work and go work at the ABA, he was really there to back me up and tell people, yeah, she's the real deal. She is really committed to this. And that means a lot, I think, when you're trying to get into public interest work, especially if you have done work in private practice or another field for a while. People know that this is tough work, that this is not for the faint of heart, that it's going to be stressful and heartbreaking, and they want someone who's going to stick with it. And so having those people who can vouch for you and vouch for how much you care about the work is really critically important. So that's been a huge one. And the connections I've made with people in the Capitol defense community have just been, they're my guide point, the people who have come before me in this work, and I'm constantly looking to them and grateful to them for helping me navigate a very, very difficult area of the law. And certainly in the legal aspect of it and coming up with the right arguments to make and the right motions to file and all that, but it's also navigating the emotional aspect of it that I think can be incredibly challenging, and without the right community around you, can drive you out of the field entirely. And so the people I met early on in my career who have been doing this work, as long as I've been alive, have been instrumental in keeping me focused and grounded and helping me get through tough things like the execution of clients and huge losses. This particular term at the Supreme Court has been brutal, and I know it has been for a lot of people, and that's tough to deal with, but the people who have been there and been through it before really can give you strength and support and kind of show you that there is a path through and how to keep fighting.
Thanks so much. And Matt, can I throw the same question to you? If there are any relationships that you've maintained that have been helpful?
Yeah, I could give a number, but given this panel and this occasion, I'd like to, two of my colleagues, Dave DeBruin and Dave Hanzo, are both PDS alums who came to Jenner afterwards, maybe a little bit like Andy. And I have learned so much from them over the years. Both of them, I think, interviewed me when I came to the firm a few years ago at this point. And both of them have taught me so much about excellent lawyering and commitment to a client that, PDS must just, it trains their folks very, very well from what I've seen in my position. So they've been invaluable to me in the hard cases where you're wondering what the right thing to do is, in the craft of lawyering where you're trying to figure out how am I going to get this point across. Dave Hanzo in particular was just a master at saying, I think what you're really saying is this. And you're like, that's right. I just didn't realize it till you told me that. I've always thought very well of PDS just from that facet of it alone. And that's been very helpful to me over the years.
Thanks so much for that. Why don't we move on to another question I wanted to ask is, I think that we all know that there is a disproportionate representation of Black and Brown individuals in the criminal justice system. And there's been a lot of protesting, especially in the last few years since George Floyd, about Black Lives Matter protests, the Black Lives Matter movement, and such. And I'm wondering if anyone on the panel is in their organization, explicitly talking about these issues and doing any work that sort of like is informed by the movement. Any push for reform? I know that Tara, you may have mentioned some legislative advocacy at PDS before, and maybe you can take up some of this initially if there's anything that PDS is doing in acknowledgement that this larger issue exists.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think since George Floyd, like PDS, and I definitely know for me personally, and I think probably for all of our colleagues and also as an organization, there has been a complete mind shift in really examining what our role is in the system, and at the core acknowledging that all of our jobs rest upon Black and brown people going into jails and prisons, right? And so that is literally what my job is a part of. And if that was not the case, then I would maybe not have a job, right? And so we really need to be effectively working ourselves out of a job and also calling out what's happening for what it is. And so that's happening on sort of a internal culture sort of level, on a client communication sort of level, as well as in litigation strategies. There's a lot of things related to race that can be litigated in a criminal case. And PDS is definitely trying to push the envelope on that. I think there's a lot of really great cutting edge stuff happening in terms of particularly for young people and young Black people in the district, and the role that targeting by the police and the trauma that happens as a result of that really informs everything going forward, and bringing that to the forefront. And these are uncomfortable things, right, to be doing in court. And some judges are receptive and some judges are not receptive. And so figuring out ways to bring that forward, because what I think the future of public defense, and it's already moving forward into that phase, is looking at ways to change the system itself fundamentally. And that requires not just thinking as, sort of the person that is effectuating rights, even though that is a really important part of it, but it is more than that. It is acknowledging what is happening and the disproportionate people who are experiencing it. And in DC specifically, virtually all my clients are Black people, and the few that are not are brown people. And so what does that mean to have that startling statistic happening, right? And dealing with that and forcing those conversations to happen. So it's definitely there. It's something that I think that all of us are figuring out what we can do, and the important thing is to be thoughtful of it. And I also think it's a really exciting time, right? Because I think there's innovation, and people are taking a stand in a way that we never have before. And so I love that, and I love collaborating with my clients on that.
Does anyone else have anything to add, sort of how your organization or your firm might be sort of trying to tackle these issues, or at least moving in a way that acknowledges that these disparities exist? Excuse me.
So I can speak to it a little bit from the law firm perspective. It's, these issues I think are really fascinating. I mean, for me, coming from PDS, where race and class issues were, top of mind in every case. And for me, it was kind of an interesting thing, being an Asian American lawyer, appearing often in front of predominantly Black juries, representing Black clients, always kind of trying to think about what the race dynamic was. And then to come to a law firm where these issues just are not discussed very often, and certainly not very comfortably. Last summer was a real change for us. I think it forced us as an organization to confront issues that we had kind of struggled with. And I think law firms are notorious for speaking about these things, but not necessarily acting on them as much as the organizations would like to do. And I think, you look at the we do a ton of really important pro bono work, and I think that's critical. What law firms tend to struggle with, though, is making their organizations more diverse, more inclusive places where people feel like they really have voice and can speak to these issues that really matter to them. and last summer, I think, kind of moved the firm in a good direction. I think people felt empowered to speak up because it was so much a part of the national conversation, and the firms had to confront the idea that, you know, that the pro bono work we do is really important, and it says a lot about what we value as a firm. But there are also institutional changes that we need to make as a firm as well, to make the place a more properly functioning institution. And we're still very much in that process. So
I can hop in before we go to the next question. I was going to say that our organization, you know, a lot of people tend to think of racial justice just in terms of someone who has been accused, but our demographics of our clients, and also the demographics generally of people who have been victimized, are largely people of color. And so that's something that often gets lost in the talks of racial justice and criminal legal reform, of the fact that many people going through the criminal legal system have been victimized themselves. And so I think thinking of criminal legal reform more holistically, not just as you're on this side or you're the other, but as individuals who have often gone through several types of trauma, right? Like generational trauma and institutional traumas, and kind of looking at it from a bigger picture, I think has been one of the pushes that we've worked really closely with DC Justice Lab and ACLU DC to try and have legislators and attorneys starting to think of criminal legal reform differently, and thinking about how we as attorneys that perhaps are contributing to the continuity of certain systems and certain processes, and pushing ourselves to really think about how we can support clients differently. And is it always, for example, in my role, like, can we offer alternatives to going to report a crime to the police? Are there alternatives like restorative justice or community violence interrupters that we can help support and try to draw attention to funding so that the city can provide those options as well? And also thinking about I think the places where lawyers perhaps should become involved more frequently and earlier on in the process to try and divert getting into the criminal legal system. For example, some of our clients are gunshot and stabbing victims that are going to the hospital and then being treated as suspects once they arrive there. And so we have our attorneys talk to them and give them brief advice about their rights, and to try and, again, intervene before something escalates into a situation where they're trying to receive medical care and all of a sudden they're being arrested or they're being interrogated. And so I think, like, really taking a step back and, again, kind of just acknowledging the realities that some folks are facing different barriers than we perhaps are accustomed to in our own lives. And I think challenging the way that we are lawyering and the options that we're presenting to our clients, and trying to imagine, like, can there be something else? Can we be adjusting ourselves to try and help our clients imagine a different system?
Thanks so much, Naida. And we do have one question that I want to ask while we have it, and we're still on the topic of race and racism in the criminal justice system. The question is, considering racial disparities, how do you all think that any anti-critical race theory legislation influences criminal law and the death penalty work? I see, Naida, you're shaking your head. So maybe you have an answer to that?
Well, I'm going to defer to the experts here, but I mean, I don't think you can really have a conversation about the death penalty without talking about race and race theory. It's so central to it. I mean, I think it's not a matter of any of our opinions. You can see it in the statistics, but again, I will let the experts speak about it.
Emily, did you have anything to add to that?
Suppose that was my cue. I mean, Naida is absolutely right that you can't talk about the death penalty without talking about race. And my entire field is critical race theory, I guess, in that sense. So, I mean, I think a lot of this legislation it obviously is, becoming a political bargaining chip in a very terrible way. But I think it's essential that these concepts, that this reality is continuing to be taught in law schools at the very least, so that aspiring public interest lawyers, people who want to work in the criminal justice system at all, whether it's on the defense side, the prosecution, the victim side, are aware of the reality. I think that, I mean, I always direct people to the Equal Justice Initiative if they want to learn more about this topic and about the way that the death penalty is the legacy of lynching. And they've done tremendous work on that topic. But all of our cases involve race. All of our cases are inextricably linked with the history of racism in this country and racial violence in this country. And I think that to say otherwise, you cannot be an effective lawyer in this area without acknowledging that history and acknowledging that that is the reality that your clients are living in and facing. And I just also wanted to echo real quickly one thing that Naida said earlier about the Black and brown people being victims as well as defendants in the system. She and I are not on opposite sides here. Her clients are my clients, and we have to always be aware when we're working with our clients that they have almost always been the victims of violent crime as well, and that comes into play, in a variety of ways, including if their case moves toward execution, the fears they have, having been the victim of violence many times in their lives before that. And so it's something that if you're not, at least, even if you haven't experienced that, even if you are a person who has different life experiences, you need to be aware of that fact, that you've had different life experiences, and be aware of, at least intellectually aware of what your clients are facing, and do your best to try to understand it and be cognizant of it in all the decisions that you make in their case to meet their needs. So I know that got a little off the topic of CRT, but I just wanted to echo that because I think it's a really important point about the people that we are trying to help in these jobs.
No, I appreciate that. And it sounds relevant overall. And it's not just the times, it's a disparity that we've all known about for years, but it's great that it's finally coming to the forefront of the conversations and thinking about how this work is approached. One thing, Naida, that you mentioned earlier was about violence interrupters and diversion programs. And so I do want to get a little bit into alternatives for sentencing or punishment or criminal justice, sort of like your traditional prosecution, and ask about restorative justice. This may be a question for Naida or Tara, but anyone, please feel free to chime in if you have any thoughts or perspective. First, can someone sort of give us an idea of what is restorative justice, and then how does that show up in the work that you do, if at all?
And I can start, but definitely not going to pretend to be an expert on restorative justice, because that is just a beautiful but very complex field, and there's transformative justice versus restorative. But my understanding and the way that we apply it in our own work is that it can really look very differently depending on what the participants are looking for. And for example, in our own restorative justice project, we've had it simply be a circle with both participants, the person who has suffered harm and the person who's being accused of harm, having a conversation. Sometimes the person accused of harm doesn't want to participate, and instead their family members or maybe community members are a part. I know that the DC Office of Attorney General have a restorative justice program now that's fantastic. And again, trying to reach out to people who have been accused of harm and kind of having a conversation and seeing what is going on. And again, like I mentioned earlier, trying to just create a space where there is the opportunity to have a conversation and perhaps identify whether there are other factors such as mental health issues or issues related to poverty that are really being more contributory than anything else in the situation, and whether there are other outlets that are more beneficial for the folks that are being accused of causing harm. And actually, we have not to plug it, sorry, I don't mean to be shameless, but we have a podcast on trauma-informed education, and we do have an interview with someone from OAG talking about how they had a case where there was this youth who was accused of vandalizing a store, and how OAG brought them together to basically talk about the impact that it had on the store owner to be vandalized, and how that youth ended up apologizing, and they had a great relationship. And there was just that accountability without having the criminal legal system involved. And so again, I think perhaps this is something we have to push more for in law schools, but again, being more willing as an attorney to kind of look around and say, like, can we try something different instead of, you know, trying to be as adversarial as we normally are and heading to court? Like, can we just talk it out as attorneys? And I know that, for example, in Title IX, I've reached out to the opposing party to see if we can come up with an informal resolution outside of the administrative processes. But I feel like in law school, that wasn't perhaps pushed as much. I mean, outside of like pretrial litigation class where it's more of like negotiation, but again, in a much more adversarial sense. So I think restorative justice is something that is going to continue to evolve as more people try to accept it and people are kind of figuring out the different models that work for the different types of harm that are being that's being raised. I know that many people are very anti-sexual assault survivors participating in restorative justice, but it's my organization's view that we really believe that everyone should be empowered to decide what's right for them. And we shouldn't be just saying like, okay, this topic area shouldn't be available for restorative justice processes, and this should be. We should just be letting people decide for themselves. But I'm sorry, I've gone on a tangent. Tara, please jump in.
No, that was great. I have had the benefit of seeing restorative justice in action, but not so much in DC. That was more things that I sought out when I was in law school in California. And there are a lot of really great practices in the Bay Area around restorative justice. Unfortunately, because I work at PDS, and so pretty much all our clients are facing really serious criminal cases, and it's just not something that is on the table at all. But one of the things that I do is coming up with alternatives to prison. And particularly, like, one of my passion projects is working on that for young people under the age of 25. And the district has really made a push to identify that as a group that is deserving of being treated differently because of brain science that we all know for people that are juveniles and young adults. And so there are other ways to come up with alternatives, even within the very sort of limited parameters that we have. And one of them is trying to really encourage the use of the juvenile system versus the adult system for people under the age of 18, because the United States Attorney's Office always has the option of charging somebody as an adult for certain offenses for somebody who is a later teen. And we're really trying to advocate even for, again, you know, that the 18 to 25 group is also going to be treated differently. And that might play out in terms of when you're doing your plea negotiations, and then also before sentencing with the court, to make sure that everybody is aware that what the impact is going to be on that young person if you do send them to a prison of incarceration. And, you know, younger people tend to have less records, right? So it's their first time ever going into prison. And so this is going to be a hugely formative event for them, and it will affect them for the rest of their life. And what are we trying to say as a community when we send somebody into that system, right? So if there is any last chance of intervention, it's probably right now. And so let's think about ways that we can come up with creative sentencing and supportive reentry plans, which I work at an agency that is fortunate enough to have an incredible team of other divisions, social workers, special education attorneys, civil attorneys that can help put together those plans, and also explain what has already been referred to, which is the reason why we got to where we are today. And so much of understanding that informs the ability to have an alternative to just sending somebody to prison. Because if you can explain and identify and prove what happened before that led to this moment, then you can get people on board with, well, what do we do? What do we need to do to make it better, to create a better outcome for everybody involved as well? And yeah, so that's very much what I'm trying to do, and what we are. There's sort of limited parameters depending on what we're facing, but I think young people is like a great area where there's a lot of innovation happening and a lot of movement in the district specifically in trying to address that.
Thanks so much to you both for answering that question. Matt, I want to ask you a question. This might be an interesting transition, but I will admit that the only reason that I'm even sort of familiar with at least how complex appellate litigation is in the criminal space is through podcasts. So I listen to like Serial, Undisclosed, you know, all of those. And so, and I wonder sort of what's your thought on those types of mediums, specifically in getting young practitioners or law students interested in understanding sort of like what is the role of appellate advocacy and or litigation in this space, and what are ways you can set up not only that interest, but also lining up that experience if this is something that you might be interested in, if podcasts and things of that nature that are sort of ever evolving are hurtful or harmful to the practice. If you have any thoughts about it at all, I would be interested in hearing that.
Well, I mean, Serial was like the game changer, I think. I'm not a podcast expert, but it seemed like everybody started talking about law and podcasts after Serial. And, there's, is it good or bad? Look, ultimately, when you're telling a story in retrospective, it's a little different than litigating it up, when you don't know what the ending is going to be. So, life isn't always like a produced podcast, however probative and thoughtful it is. And looking backwards, of course, is how we learn. So it's a great endeavor. What I think about is, and I don't think this necessarily ties to podcasts in particular, but it's all part of a piece. I'm going to stop my phone from ringing. See, technology gets you, whether it's a podcast or a phone. I mean, who's to say? The thing that I sometimes, part of appellate advocacy is you either don't know your panel ahead of time or you do know your panel ahead of time. And either way, your goal is to find the argument that's you think is most likely to reach your decision maker. And sometimes that's a trickier lesson when you're starting out. And of all the things you might say, there's some judges who will probably agree with certain things and some who won't. And then you need to find the argument, if it's available, that gets you the best result for your client with the panel that you have. And in some ways, litigating in front of the Supreme Court is the clearest example of that, because all 9 of them, who they are. It's the full panel every time. Most of them have been there for quite a while and have a long record of positions in the cases. And that really presents, that's the universe that you're working with to try to get the best result. Now, that doesn't mean you abandon what you think is right, but it does mean that you try to channel what you think is right in the manner that is the best, gives you the best possible chance of succeeding. And, with podcasts and things like that, it's sometimes, there's just a difference between looking back and sort of saying, this was the truth, versus looking forward and saying, what's my best way of getting to a good result in this case? So I don't know if that speaks to your question or not, but that's sort of what came to mind when you mentioned it.
No, it definitely does, and I appreciate it. I think that a lot of people have asked me that question before, even though, I've moderated and people have asked that question. It's been a question that we haven't been able to answer in past panels. So I appreciate you taking the time to bring it up here. I think I'm going to ask one more question before we turn it over to the audience for questions. And my question is for Andy. You mentioned earlier, I think that, I believe you mentioned that, sometimes some people would ask sort of how could you represent someone who's charged with such a heinous offense, or maybe someone else mentioned it, but at least in your PDS experience, maybe you've encountered that question. But I also wondered if there's sort of a similar question with like white collar criminal defense, if there are any like myths that people might have in terms of like working in that space, but also I guess the general like gravity of the morality of representing someone. Maybe Emily, this is a question that you could answer as well. Someone that's facing the death penalty, like having that sort of like weight on your shoulders and working in this important area where people's lives and liberty are at stake. Andy, are there any ways that you've had to sort of like confront those questions of morality or the gravity or the gravamen of a case sort of like weighing heavily on you because of what's happening in it or what charges there are?
Yeah, so I haven't gotten the same kinds of questions, which surprises you, right? You'd expect people to say, well, how can you represent somebody who stole $10 million from Medicare? But you don't get those questions as often as I used to get them about misdemeanors when I was at PDS. But I think, look, the gravity of representing somebody is profound in all of these cases, right? Even in the white collar cases that I've had, people always said, well, the pressure will be less, when it's not kind of liberty. I'm not sure that's really true. I mean, the essence of lawyering ultimately is that you have a client who is depending very heavily on you. And part of what I found so interesting about the practice when I came to the firm is there are folks in this firm that are representing clients in civil litigation matters who are really kind of doing in some ways work that was similar to what motivated me about my work as a public defender, right? Clients are not necessarily facing the kind of structural, cultural disadvantages that a lot of my PDS clients did, but they're facing a legal system that feels like it's stacked against them, that can be really impenetrable, that can feel incredibly unfair. Sometimes they're dealing with government agencies where the government gets incredible deference from the courts, and that just feels wrong. And so the pressures are become very personal and very individual. And so it's interesting to me. It's often not quite as different as I thought it might be when I came out of the public defender service in that regard. So.
Thank you so much. So that's all the questions that I have. And again, I encourage people to either, if you have questions, so feel free to put it in the Q&A. If you just want to take your mic off, I think people have the ability to do that. But for now, I can turn it back over to Christina to sort of wrap us up and sort of shepherd us through the question and answer phase and tell us what's next. So, but thank you to all the panelists. I really appreciate your willingness to participate, your candidness in answering the questions. So thank you. Tara, I see you have your hand up.